Welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week we take a closer look at the anti-lockdown protests in China and the international reactions to them, including the solidarity protests in cities across the world. Many see the protests as the Chinese exercising their fundamental human rights and a rare expression of dissent against the government, some of whom have called for President Xi Jinping to resign. My guest this week is Prof. Ibrahim, an associate professor of international relations. He's a sinologist who studies the socio-economic and political developments of China, a fellow of Zhejiang Normal University in China who obtained his doctorate from the Central China University in Wuhan. He's currently the head of Department Political Science and International Relations at the University of Abuja here in Nigeria. It's a conversation you don't want to miss. But that's ahead after a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles. Nigeria, through the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission NIDCOM, has been nominated to co-chair the 10th Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OACPS, as Diaspora Champion, the first Diaspora Summit to be organized by the OACPS. The nomination came via an official communication to NIDCOM chairman Abike Dabiri-Erewa through the Nigerian ambassador to Brussels, Ambassador Obinna Onowu. It said NIDCOM's nomination as OACPS champion recognized the Commission for its pioneering efforts in diaspora engagements on the continent. This year's OACPS summit holds on December 10 in the Angolan capital Rwanda. The Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States holds on December 10. Co-chairing the summit will be NIDCOM chairman Abike Dabiri-Erewa and Secretary General George Robelo Pinto Chikoti. West African leaders say they will establish a regional peacekeeping force to intervene in member states to help restore security and constitutional order in a region that has witnessed coups in the past few years. ECOWAS has not given details of how the force will be constituted, but says defense chiefs will meet next month to work out how it would operate. ECOWAS leaders also expressed concern over the continued detention of 46 Ivorian soldiers in Mali. They asked the Malian authorities to release the soldiers.
The leaders are determined to establish a regional force that will intervene in the event of need, whether this is against terrorism or to restore constitutional order in member countries.
Finally, Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa met President Isaac Herzog on Sunday, in the first visit by an Israeli head of state to the Gulf states since the countries forged ties 2 years ago, and as a right-wing coalition government takes shape in Israel. Herzog also held a meeting with the kingdom's foreign minister, Abdul Latif Al-Zayan. Herzog, whose post is largely ceremonial, will then visit the United Arab Emirates, which also normalized ties with Israel in US-brokered pacts known as the Abraham Accords, and they had already hosted the Israeli president. It's been decades since we've seen multiple protests in China. The country's zero-COVID policy has been in effect 3 years even after the COVID pandemic. What's unique about it is why the people are protesting and how widespread the protests have become.
The protests began as solidarity for victims of the Urumqi fire that killed 10 people in a high-rise building at the capital of the Xinjiang region. Many internet users surmised that residents could not escape in time because the building was partially locked down, which the city officials denied. In Shanghai, China's most populous city and financial hub, residents gathered on the night of November the 26th at the city's Urumqi Road, which borrows its name from Urumqi, for a vigil that turned into a protest in the early hours of Sunday. In footage circulating on Chinese social media, protesters were seen shouting, "Communist Party step down," as well as the president, and called for an end to the lockdown in Xinjiang. It was a rare public protest against the country's leadership. Police were also seen detaining several people at the protest site and bundling them into police vehicles. Video uploaded on social media also showed the BBC journalists covering the protest in Shanghai being detained by police. The journalists are seen with the Chinese police as voices by bystanders can be heard chanting, "Release, release." He's later seen being led away. By Monday, the protest had spread to the Chinese capital, Beijing. Two groups of protesters totaling at least 1,000 people were gathered along the Chinese capital's Third Ring Road near the Liangma River, refusing to disperse. The protest then went international. A large crowd gathered outside the Chinese embassy in London. In Tokyo, in Hong Kong, in the United States, and in faraway Australia.
Freedom for China! Freedom for China! We want freedom for China!
World leaders watched from a distance but never failed to raise their voices, calling on the Chinese government to lift the COVID restrictions.
To protests that we're seeing in China, protests that we're seeing for different reasons in Iran, in other places. Our position is the same everywhere, which is that we support the right of people everywhere to peacefully protest, to make known their views, their concerns, and their frustrations.
China ramped up mass testing and vaccinations, and by the end of the week began easing testing requirements and quarantine rules in some cities.
Joining me now on the program is an associate professor of international relations and sinology who studies the socio-economic and political developments of China. He's also head of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Abuja. He is a fellow of Zhejiang Normal University, China, and obtained his PhD from the Central China University, Wuhan. Professor Sharif Ibrahim, thank you for joining me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm sure that you have been following, the events in China over the last couple of weeks. The protests have been going on. Let me start by asking you if you believe that there have been protests out of China, because many of the videos that we have seen, especially from China, from those regions, regions in China, Shanghai, from Beijing, from all the way from Guangzhou, they've all been online, not portrayed on Chinese media. So do you believe that there have been protests in the country?
Yes, of course, there have been protests in China, which started in Urumqi, which is the, let me say, northwestern part of China, a province called Xinjiang province. And there are also protests in Beijing, in Shanghai, as well as Nanjing province. So these protests are actually real, and they have been actually going on, by people who have developed a kind of a sense of resentment due to what happened in Urumqi, Xinjiang province, as a result of the zero tolerance, on the COVID-19. So one thing we must actually note is that protest is actually universal. Recently, we had our NSAS protest in Nigeria, which virtually the government did not welcome, and the security personnel were actually, successful in dealing with that. In France, we've had that. In United States of America, we've had the Black Lives Matter, and so many other places. So this is the first fundamental thing that we must actually understand. And the protest in China, is a kind of an unprecedented one since the one they had in 1989, the Tiananmen Square protest, as well as the incident. So this is just a kind of a replication of what occurred in 1989, because China had never experienced a huge protest, as such, from 1989. So the major reason is well known. The entire world has come to know about the instigating factor, the precipitating factor that actually instigated the protest due to the fire outrage, kill at least 10 persons. But again, even in Nigeria, we've had almost similar case during the lockdown because people were actually under the lockdown. There was no food, there was no means of livelihood. Life had become so miserable and people could not actually tolerate it. I could remember in Abuja here, the so-called palliatives that were actually being stored in so many storage facilities. The youth, even married women, began to actually, boggle these particular storage facilities in order to fetch from what has been stored from these particular storage facilities. So the people of Xinjiang, the people of Shanghai, Beijing, they had become so tired of the lockdown to the level that this was a good cause. This was a major instigating factor that actually led to the outbreak of this particular protest.
A major protest like this was in Tiananmen Square, the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. And since then, we haven't seen dissent in China before. Why do you think, that the Chinese COVID policy, the no-zero COVID policy exists, and why it is so important for China to have this?
Yes, of course. You could remember that the initial stage of the outbreak of the COVID-19 was experienced in Wuhan. And in that particular period, from the late 2019 to early 1920, 2020, China began to actually experience a lockdown, especially in Wuhan and other vital cities, that began to experience the outbreak of the COVID-19. So now China does not want to see a repetition of what had actually occurred in 2020. And that is why for China, the people are very important. So also the economy is very important. So, and it is going to be an embarrassment for China to allow the COVID to actually re-emerge again, because it is expecting that once this is not actually critically dealt with, there is going to be a kind of massive casualty of people in China. So that is why the government of China issued this particular, policy, zero tolerance, on COVID-19, and decided to continue with the lockdown. So it was unfortunate that this particular fire outrage and outbreak was experienced in Urumqi, and the government of China, did not expect such a huge and massive protest, even though the Chinese government has been trying by all means, as well as possible ways to make sure that the COVID-19 is fully contained. And but people, have become so tired of the lockdown. Why? Because a majority of the Chinese people are business people and business oriented. People do not, have the opportunity and chance to go to work, to go to market, to go to their shops. And, they are not even allowed to walk, in the streets of these particular major cities where the protests are actually ongoing. So this particular level of, anger made people become so furious. So for them to actually become so furious, the only way for them to show that particular furiosity is when they come out of the street, showing placards, when they were even writing with some write-ups on the placard. Now they even resorted to raising empty placards, showing that the world and the government of China, you know what we mean. What we mean is enough is enough.
My interview with Professor Sharif Ibrahim on China's COVID policy and the international community's response continues after the break. Join us again. And now back to my interview with Professor Ibrahim, who, among other things, is a sinologist who studies the socio-economic and political developments of China. Professor, we do understand, the frustration, but the thing is, and you already said it, why this is important to China, because of the embarrassment, to the rest of the world, because the COVID-19 virus was found in China, in Wuhan, in China. But then again, some experts have said, China only administers its own COVID-19 vaccines to its own citizens. And some experts have said that the Chinese vaccine is not as effective as the others. And so is it realistic, really, for a no-zero COVID in China, given the population and, wondering how much success this no-zero COVID policy has had on the people as well as the economy?
It is actually realistic. Why? Because if you go back to the memory lane, you understand that China has been able to actually contain the spread of the COVID-19. Ab initio, more than the United States, more than the entire European continent. And this is just a resurgence, the reemergence of the virus, in China. And the government of China became so wary that the effort we have put in place this particular decade, to develop, to build our economy, if this virus is actually allowed to continue to spread, then the entire effort which we have actually committed in building the economy and our people might actually draw us back. There is going to be a flinch back, on the economy, on the successes recorded recently, by China. So we should understand that it is very realistic, because the government of China is a committed government, if you may, and there is a government that cares about its own people. And that is why it was able to fight the virus, and it successfully opened up its economy before any other nation on earth, especially after 2020, 2021. And China has been successful in terms of bringing on track, its economy. The little chance China has now to transact with the outside world, if the COVID-19 continues, should be allowed to spread, then that is going to affect its international economic relations, because the little opening allowed for China to actually engage with the world. People will not like to travel to China. The Chinese will not be allowed to go into other places around the world. So that is why the Chinese government decided to actually adopt this particular policy for the total and a kind of a sheer containment of the COVID-19 virus, so that in order not to actually have a long-term effect, on the economy as well as people of China and other people around the world.
So the Chinese government did buckle under the pressure of the protests. So you know that they also extended to some other cities outside of China. We saw protests in the U.S., we've seen in Canada, we've seen in other Asian countries as well, calling on the governments to lift the strict lockdown, restrictions. And then the government itself began to remove COVID testing facilities in some areas. They've also eased restrictions in Shanghai and in other cities as well. President Xi is not known to bow to international pressure of any sort. So why do you think he did this?
Well, because in his political thought and philosophy, President Xi Jinping believes that the people are masters, in the society, while the government officials are servants of the people. That is why if you go to China, you will come to understand that we have People Bank of China. We have People Liberation Army. Everything in China is actually named after the people. So President Xi Jinping, for him to succeed politically, he understood that definitely he had to actually listen to the people. Also bring down some of these particular stringent and rigid measures or policies in order to suit the will of the people as well as the will of the masses. So I'm not surprised that President Xi Jinping is doing this. And the government and people of China, they are people who believe in shared future for mankind, as well as inclusive governance and multilateralism. So I believe that for him to have actually made a shift in this particular process, it is going to be good for him, good for the People's Republic of China, and good for the entire population of China and those outside, China. So I'm not surprised to have seen this particular shift, and we are going to experience more responsive, responses, from the government of China in order to make sure that they respond to the masses and to the aspirations and yearnings of the Chinese accordingly.
So if this is really about the people, then why are the videos of the protests being censored in China itself? People within, the protests are not even reported on the news. There seems to be a blackout of reportage on the protests in China itself. As I've spoken to some people, they have confessed, that there really hasn't been any videos of the protests on local or even national TV.
Universally speaking, people have the freedom as well as the right to protest when actually the situation or the circumstance warranted. But if a protest will actually become violent, especially it affects government property, government institutions, government structures, then the government has the prerogative to actually intervene in order to minimize or even do away with violence. So the security personnel in China, anti-protest units have been deployed, in various cities in order to calm down the situation as well as that particular violent protest that erupted. So therefore, the people, it's all about the people, because those who have not entered the street, those who are in the hospitals, those who have been at home should also be protected. So if such protests, was allowed to continue, it will actually trigger more violence, in the state, which the government, in its own capacity, has an obligation to maintain order, protect lives of people and property. And remember that these people, if they are allowed to actually continue protesting, the outcome, the end result might not actually be good. It might actually lead to something else, which might actually lead to colossal loss of life. So that is why it is good. There is no society, no nation will actually allow for violent protests, not even China, even the United States of America, not even United Kingdom, not even France. In recent history, in recent times, we have seen the most violent protests, the yellow vest protests in France. And the government of France has not allowed that to continue. So also China shouldn't allow that to continue. Making protests is allowed, but when it turns to be violent, the government has that particular right and obligation to maintain law and order. And we expect that, without wasting time, we expect that the government of China to respond accordingly, to speak to the people of China and make sure that their yearnings and aspirations are actually being accommodated, so that to avoid any futuristic or further uprisings in the state of China.
Would you consider it interference, that other nations are calling on the Chinese government to lift the restrictions, are asking the government to listen to its people? Would you consider that interference, as we have seen during the last week? Some world leaders have asked the Chinese government to listen to the people, and then there have been also protests, as I mentioned earlier, in other cities, people also calling on the government to lift the restrictions.
Well, just as I earlier made mention that we have regional government, regional institutions, regional organizations, especially if you go to Southeast Asia. We have the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, we have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we have the United Nations, of course. So each and every member of these particular organizations can actually advise China to listen to its own people. But before now, there have been intervention and interferences, by some independent state in the affairs of other states, which we all know. We've seen the interference, of especially the United States in African politics, in Latin America, even in Asia. We have seen the protests in in Hong Kong, and other places, and these were not without foreign interference or intervention. But I see it as normative for a government and a people to advise another government to listen to its own people. And if this is done, such a government should actually embrace such advice in order for calmness, in order for continuity, and in order for more peaceful coexistence. Remember that in international relations, it is interest and national interest. National interest matters, and it is what states present in its relations to other states. So that is why China might see it as an interference, but not interference per se on the negative perspective. Why? Because it is something given or submitted before the ears and representatives of the government for them to actually be so lenient, merciful, and less oppressive to the people. So I see nothing bad in that. But then each and every state has its own particular issues, problems, as well as political challenges. So this abruptly emanated, from Urumqi, and I believe the government of China will be able to deal with it without distance time.
Professor Sharif Ibrahim, you've spoken almost like an ambassador of China, but thank you for clearing the issues with us. It sounds like you will need to come back again to talk about, China's place in the world. Thank you for this first interview on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you for having me.
Before we go, I'd like to read some feedback on the last edition of the program. We discussed the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to the new King of England, Charles III's, which was his first state visit. My guest was Professor Christopher Isike. At Marcus Gave 7129 had said on our YouTube page, "To me, as a South African, this rivalry between Nigeria and South Africa is caused mostly by some people who think South Africa has achieved far more than it deserves. It is not common in South Africa for a news anchor to compare why country Y gets a royal visit instead of country Z. South Africa is doing all it can to bring in more African nations to international organizations such as G20, BRICS, and so on. Hopefully, Nigeria will be invited to a next year BRICS summit in South Africa." At Floyd Robinson 5131 says, "I hope he demands all of those looted artifacts to be returned back to Africa." Well, I can answer that question. We don't know, but it was not reported that he did demand the artifacts be returned. But thank you for following the conversation. I hope you follow this week's as well. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.